As chief executive, Musharraf arrogated virtual total power to himself. The general cited the substantial turmoil in the country and noted that institutions had been systematically destroyed, that the economy was in a state of near collapse, and that only the most drastic measures could even begin to improve the national condition. Musharraf said Pakistan was at a critical crossroads, and that the Sharif government had even planned to split and weaken the armed forces. Noting that he could not save both the country and the constitution at the same time, Musharraf chose to sacrifice the latter for the former. Nonetheless, the constitution had not been abrogated, merely held in abeyance until better times again allowed for its reinstatement. Careful to point out that martial law had not been imposed, he nevertheless insisted the country could not afford to perpetuate the old politics. A chief executive secretariat was hurriedly assembled in the waning days of 1999, and by mid-2000 that temporary edifice had undergone restructuring in order to give more administrative powers to the new regime. Ranking military officers assumed the most important positions in the government, and all civilian members of the Secretariat had to pass scrutiny by Army officers. The massive induction of serving military officers in the Secretariat also was aimed at providing Musharraf with the same command and discipline structure found in the Pakistan Army. The major dilemma facing Pakistan's new rulers, however, was their lack of experience in civil affairs. Moreover, on-the-job training in the day-to-day life of the country quickly caused strains within the services. Nawaz Sharif was arrested, charged and tried for high crimes, and, after being found guilty, sentenced to a long prison term. However, under international pressure he subsequently was released and sent into exile, Saudi Arabia, with the understanding that he would remain out of the country for 10 years. The actions of Pakistan's generals were coldly received by many in the outside world. Washington was quick to criticize the coup leaders, and Clinton signaled his disfavor by altering his March 2000 South Asian itinerary so as to spend only a few hours in Pakistan while stopping in India and Bangladesh for longer visits. However, the strain in U.S.-Pakistan relations was caused by a wide array of issues: Pakistan's sustained political instability, its repeated failure at constructing civil society, the impediments to a resolution of the Kashmir question, and, most significantly, what seemed to be the country's nuclear arms race with India. As was the case in previous military governments, Musharraf's announced intent was to return Pakistan to civilian rule as soon as feasible. The chief executive's plan to achieve this goal was similar in certain aspects to that put forward by Ayub Khan a generation earlier. Civilian rule had fragmented, and a return to full civilian control would first require the establishment of local democracy, harkening back to Ayub Khan's basic democracies, a system devoid of competitive political parties. However, like the generals before him, Musharraf chose in June 2001 to consolidate his power by forcing the retirement of President Rafiq Tahrir, dispensing with the title of chief executive, and making himself president. The general also effectively became head of government, since the position of prime minister had been vacant since Sharif's ouster. In July, as president, Musharraf travelled to Agra, India, where he met with Indian Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee to discuss regional security and, importantly, the status of Kashmir. No real progress was made, but the meeting set the stage for subsequent summit meetings between Musharraf and his Indian counterparts. The president appeared to be slipping into a role that promised a period of reflection on how to reconstruct the country's domestic and foreign policy. but that all was changed within 2 months by the new reality created by the September 11 attacks on the United States. Hesitant rejection of Islamist militants following Pakistan's humiliating defeat in, and loss of, East Pakistan and Zia-ul-Haq's subsequent emphasis on Islamization, the Pakistani army increasingly had been inclined to define its purpose in spiritual terms. Musharraf, long a key planner in Pakistan's military hierarchy, was linked to these trends. Initially, this constituted recruiting Islamist militants for clandestine operations in the Kashmir region. With the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, Pakistan, particularly the federally administered tribal areas, FATA, along the Afghan border, became a safe haven for such militants from all parts of the world. The Pakistani military's Inter-Service Intelligence Directorate, ISI, became the main conduit of the country's support of the Afghan Mujahideen fighters based there in their conflict with the Soviet forces in Afghanistan. Such assistance continued following the withdrawal of Moscow's forces in the late 1980s, and the ISI was instrumental in raising the Taliban as a counterforce to the rival groups seeking control of the Afghan state at that time, the strategy being to give Pakistan a dominant role in Afghanistan as that country emerged from 2 decades of constant warfare. Pakistan's political landscape changed dramatically with the events of September 11. It was quickly determined that the attacks on the United States had been staged by the Muslim militant organization Al-Qaeda, which was operating out of Afghanistan near the Pakistani border with the support of the Taliban regime. Pakistan had diplomatic relations with Afghanistan, but Musharraf hesitated to put pressure on the Taliban to arrest al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. However, as al-Qaeda and the Taliban became judged a single entity, the United States demanded Pakistani assistance as it prepared to move militarily against both organizations. Musharraf chose to side with the U.S.-led coalition against the Taliban. Musharraf's decision to join the American effort was met with outrage by Islamist conservatives in Pakistan. Thousands of pro-Taliban Pakistani volunteers crossed the border to help in the fight against U.S. troops and their coalition allies when those forces invaded and occupied Afghanistan in the fall of 2001. In the period following the September 11 attacks and the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, the population of Islamist militants boomed in the FATA, as Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters found refuge over the border in Pakistan. Many more Muslim recruits flocked to the FATA from abroad, eager to join the conflict. Musharraf was pressured by Washington to take aggressive action against these Islamist operatives in the tribal areas, and the Pakistani military launched a major campaign to combat militants, particularly in mountainous Waziristan. However, the tribal Pashtun region historically had been off-limits to the central government, and Pakistan's military action not only challenged Pashtun tribal autonomy there, but it also affected members of the Pashtun community not involved with the militants. When government forces were met with stiff resistance, the soldiers, often paramilitary and recruited from similar tribal orders, refused to fight or fought with little enthusiasm. Musharraf dismissed a number of army officers deemed sympathetic to the Taliban, and numerous foreign jihadists, including al-Qaeda militants, were arrested by Pakistani authorities and turned over to coalition officials, but the United States continued to accuse Islamabad, and particularly Musharraf, of not doing enough to contain the terrorist threat. In April 2002, Musharraf, seeking to formalize his position as the head of state, held and overwhelmingly won a referendum granting him an additional 5 years as president. The referendum also reinstated the constitution, though modified with provisions spelled out in a document called the Legal Framework Order, LFO. In addition to extending Musharraf's term, the LFO expanded the president's powers and increased the number of members of both houses of the legislature. Parliamentary elections followed in October under the limitations imposed by the LFO. And Musharraf's adopted political party, the Pakistan Muslim League, PMLQ, took more of the seats in the National Assembly than any other contending party. The party subsequently forged a coalition government headed by PMLQ leader Mir Zafarullah Khan Jamali, a veteran politician and former Nawaz Sharif supporter. The opposition PPP polled next highest, but it was a coalition of religious parties known as the Muttahida Majlis-e-Amal, MMA, that made the most notable showing, marking the first time a Pakistani religious organization had gained a significant voice in parliament. The MMA was vehemently opposed to Musharraf's policy of confronting Islamist groups, and, after gaining a dominant political role in the northwest frontier province, the MMA openly questioned the army's actions in Waziristan. Musharraf's government had been combating religious extremism at home, banning some of the more militant groups that had long been active in Pakistan and rounding up hundreds of religious activists. However, Musharraf generally had not addressed Islamist violence in Kashmir. Low-level fighting and skirmishing took place along the line of control there until late November 2003, when, unexpectedly, the Pakistani government declared a unilateral ceasefire and sought negotiations with New Delhi. The following month, two attempts were made on the president's life. Acts of political and religious violence continued to escalate, particularly those between Sunni and Shia factions. Late in December, the parliament ratified most provisions of the LFO as the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, confirming Musharraf's power to dismiss a prime minister, dissolve the National Assembly, and appoint chiefs of the armed forces and provincial governors. In January 2004, Musharraf sought and received an unprecedented vote of confidence from a parliamentary electoral college. In August, Shaukat Aziz, a former banker and Minister of Finance, took the premiership. Musharraf, however, clearly continued to hold the reins of power, and, despite repeated promises to return the country to full civilian authority, he announced at the end of the year that the country was too fragile for him to comply with his own deadlines. This applied also to the president's refusal to step down as head of the armed forces, despite repeated demands by political opponents that he do so. On the other side of the political spectrum, Musharraf had to contend with constant attacks from the MMA, who accused him of seeking to secularize Pakistan. The country continued to be subject to increasing incidents of sectarian violence, including suicide bombings at mosques and other public places. Adding to this human-generated calamity, Pakistan suffered a devastating earthquake in October 2005 in the Kashmir region that killed tens of thousands of people and left hundreds of thousands homeless. In early 2007, Musharraf began seeking re-election to the presidency. However, because he remained head of the military, opposition parties and then the Pakistan Supreme Court objected on constitutional grounds. In March, Musharraf dismissed Chief Justice Iftikhar Muhammad Chaudhry, which sparked a general strike of Pakistani lawyers and outbreaks of violent protest in various parts of the country. The Supreme Court overturned the dismissal in July, and Chaudhry was reinstated. In October, an electoral college consisting of the parliament and 4 provincial legislatures voted to give Musharraf another 5-year term, although opposition members refused to participate in the proceedings. After the Supreme Court delayed the pronouncement of this outcome, in order to review its constitutionality, Musharraf declared a state of emergency in early November. The constitution was once again suspended, members of the Supreme Court, including Chaudhry, were dismissed, and the activities of independent news media organizations were curtailed. Later in the month, the Supreme Court, reconstituted with Musharraf appointees, upheld his re-election. Musharraf subsequently resigned his military commission and was sworn into the presidency as a civilian. In the fall of 2007, Nawaz Sharif and Benazir Bhutto, who had also been living in exile, were permitted to return to Pakistan, and each began campaigning for upcoming parliamentary elections scheduled for early January 2008. At the end of December, however, Bhutto was assassinated at a political rally in Rawalpindi, an act that stunned Pakistanis and set off riots and rampages in different parts of the country. Musharraf, having only just lifted the state of emergency, had to again place the armed forces on special alert, and he was forced to postpone the election until mid-February. The outcome of the voting was seen as a rejection of Musharraf and his rule. His PMLQ party finished a distant third behind the PPP, now led by Asif Ali Zardari, Bhutto's widower, which captured about 1/3 of the parliamentary seats up for election, and Sharif's party, the PMLN, with about 1/4 of the seats. In March, the PPP and PMLN formed a coalition government. Yusuf Raza Gilani, a prominent member of the PPP and a former National Assembly Speaker, was elected Prime Minister. Disagreements emerged within the governing coalition in the months following its formation, particularly regarding the reinstatement of the Supreme Court judges Musharraf had dismissed late the previous year, and these disputes threatened to destabilize the alliance. Nevertheless, in August 2008 the coalition moved to begin impeachment charges against Musharraf, citing grave constitutional violations. On August 18, faced with the impending proceedings, Musharraf resigned. PMLQ candidate won enough support to pose a challenge to Zardari, the PP's candidate, and on September 6, 2008, he was elected president. Friction between Zardari and Sharif intensified in early 2009 when the Supreme Court voted to disqualify Sharif's brother from his position as Chief Minister of the Punjab and to uphold a ban prohibiting Sharif himself from holding political office. The ban stemmed from his 2000 conviction for high crimes. Sharif alleged that the court's rulings were politically motivated and backed by Zardari. In addition, the status of the Supreme Court judges dismissed under Musharraf, who had yet to be reinstated, one of the issues that had undermined the Sharif-Zardari coalition, remained a major source of conflict between the two rivals. In March 2009, Sharif broke free of an attempt to place him under house arrest and headed toward the capital, where he planned to hold a rally advocating for the reinstatement of the judges. Faced with this prospect, the government agreed to reinstate Chief Justice Chaudhry and a number of other Supreme Court judges who had not yet been returned to their posts. The move was seen as a political victory for Sharif and a significant concession on the part of Zardari, who is thought to have opposed Chaudhry's return because of the possibility that the amnesty Zardari had received under Musharraf might be overturned. Shortly thereafter, Sharif's brother was also returned to his position, and the ruling that banned Sharif from holding office was lifted in May. Meanwhile, against the backdrop of the political drama of 2008, there were also developments on the foreign relations front. That year the United States expanded its campaign of targeted killings by remotely piloted drones in Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas, a region known to be a haven for Pashtun militants waging a guerrilla war against international forces and the Afghan government in Afghanistan. The drone strikes, which had begun in 2004 under the direction of the Central Intelligence Agency with the silent approval of the Pakistani government, stirred up widespread public outrage in Pakistan as they increased in frequency and caused increasing numbers of civilian deaths and injuries. Although Pakistani leaders decried the strikes as violations of Pakistan's sovereignty, there continued to be reports of the government's secret cooperation. Later that year, limited trade between the Pakistani and Indian administered portions of Kashmir resumed. It was the first such commerce in more than 60 years and signaled improved relations between the two countries. In the summer of 2010, Pakistan faced the most destructive floods in the country's recorded history, swollen by unusually heavy monsoon rains. The Indus River, which in a typical monsoon season can expand to more than half a mile, 1 kilometer, by the time it reaches the provinces of Punjab and Sindh, grew to some 15 times its normal breadth. By mid-August, more than 1,500 Pakistanis had died as a result of the river's extraordinary flooding, and, with some one-fourth of the country touched by the floods, many millions more were affected to various degrees. The humanitarian disaster caused by the flooding was marked by shortages of food and drinking water, the threat of waterborne disease, looting and violence, and the disruption of transportation and communications infrastructure. In a country so reliant upon its agriculture, the inundation, which submerged swaths of cropland and killed large populations of livestock, promised to have a lasting effect on the production of food and of raw materials such as cotton, which sustains the country's export-heavy textile industry. Religious tensions reappeared in January 2011 with the assassination of the governor of Punjab province, Salman Taseer, by a member of his own security detail. Taseer, a member of the PPP and a political ally of Zardari, had been among the most vocal critics of Pakistan's blasphemy law, which called for the death penalty if a defendant was convicted of defaming Islam or Muhammad. Although the law, which was established in the 1980s under Zia-ul-Haq's Islamization program, had not resulted in any executions for blasphemy, it had become a point of contention between religious conservatives and secular politicians. Taseer's assassination, carried out by an elite police commando with a history of Islamic radicalism, raised fears that moderate politicians were vulnerable to intimidation by religious conservatives. The public reaction to the assassination further highlighted the divisions in Pakistani society. While the PPP and most other political parties condemned the attack, many religious leaders and organizations denounced Taseer as an apostate and praised his killer for defending Islam. On May 2, 2011, a U.S. military operation in Pakistan killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of the al-Qaeda network. The assault, carried out by a small team transported by helicopter, was launched after U.S. intelligence located bin Laden living in a walled compound in Abbottabad, a medium-sized city near Islamabad. Bin Laden's presence in Abbottabad threatened to add new tension to the often troubled security alliance between the United States and Pakistan. Pakistani officials had often denied claims that bin Laden was hiding out in Pakistan, possibly abetted by Islamic militants in the remote and rugged areas on the Afghan border. After bin Laden's death, the news that he had in fact lived in a large compound in an affluent area near the Pakistan Military Academy, one of the country's most prestigious military institutes, raised questions about how his presence could have escaped the notice of Pakistan's security forces. Zardari and the PPP-led governing coalition entered legislative elections in May 2013 with low approval ratings because of widespread discontent over corruption and weak economic development. The main beneficiary was Nawaz Sharif, whose reputation as a businessman and economic reformer helped the PMLN win considerably more seats than its closest challengers, the PPP and Imran Khan's Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf (PTI), Pakistan Justice Movement Party, positioning Sharif for a third term as Prime Minister. Sharif began his third term as Prime Minister as a popular reformer. The economy improved substantially, with higher growth rates, a stable rupee, and lower inflation. The country's infrastructure, however, continued to face hurdles, with demand for electricity outpacing supply and resulting in frequent and widespread shortages. His foreign policy agenda was oriented toward liberalizing trade, including with Pakistan's neighbors. To do so, he made overtures for peaceful relations with India and post-NATO Afghanistan and attempted to reach a peace settlement with the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan (TTP), an Islamist insurgency operating in Pakistan and unaffiliated with the Taliban in neighboring Afghanistan. Under Sharif, Pakistan saw significant investment from China as the flagship program of China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. China lent Pakistan tens of billions of dollars in order to develop Pakistan's infrastructure and build a China-Pakistan Economic Corridor (CPEC) that would allow China access to cheaper, more efficient trade routes. One of the program's grandest projects was the development of the Gwadar seaport and a highway connecting it to China's Xinjiang province. However, with the development projects paid for through hefty loans from China that required employment of Chinese businesses, Pakistan's debt ballooned. Sharif's foreign outreach agenda stepped on the toes of the military establishment and the opposition. When opposition protests in 2014 provided a premise for the military to oust Sharif with popular support, the military instead used the opportunity to pressure Sharif to defer to military generals on matters of foreign policy and defense. The 2015 leak of confidential international financial documents known as the Panama Papers linked 3 of Sharif's children to offshore companies that they had allegedly used to purchase real estate in London. Sharif and his children denied any wrongdoing, but a corruption probe was opened into the matter. In 2017, the Supreme Court disqualified Sharif from holding public office, forcing his resignation. He was replaced by Shahid Khaqan Abbasi as Prime Minister. Sharif's brother Shehbaz Sharif was selected to lead the PMLN party in the next elections. Sharif and his family went into exile, and in July 2018 he and his daughter Maryam Nawaz Sharif were convicted in absentia. They returned to Lahore on July 13 to serve their sentences, saying that they were giving themselves up for the people of Pakistan at a critical juncture. Ahead of the elections, they were arrested shortly after arriving. When the elections were held in late July, Imran Khan's PTI party appeared to outperform the PMLN. To guarantee security in the highly contentious election, the military had stationed at least 350,000 troops at the polling stations, and the Election Commission had granted the military express judicial power at those polling stations. While Khan praised the elections as the fairest in Pakistan's history, the PMLN and the other parties expressed concern that the military had interfered in the elections, especially after their poll observers were ordered to leave polling stations before votes were counted. Nonetheless, the PMLN conceded, allowing Khan to seek a coalition and become prime minister. Under Khan, Pakistan saw significant developments in its foreign relations. Just weeks into his premiership, the United States decided to withhold $300 million in promised military aid, saying that the country had not done enough to fight terrorism. Relations improved, however, and the aid was restored the following year, after Pakistan made successful efforts to pressure the Taliban in Afghanistan into peace talks. Afghanistan's central government initially thanked Pakistan for its efforts, but diplomatic relations soured after. Comments by Khan undermined the authority of the central government. Tensions with India over Kashmir came to a head in February 2019, after a suicide bombing there resulted in the deaths of 40 Indian security personnel, when a militant group believed to operate illegally in Pakistan took credit for the attack. The Indian Air Force conducted airstrikes in Pakistan for the first time in 5 decades. Though India claimed it had destroyed a large training camp belonging to the militant group, Pakistan denied that any such camp had existed and said that India had struck an empty field. Instead, the next day Pakistan shot down 2 fighter jets from India and captured a pilot, who was soon returned to India. Despite the skirmishes, the two countries seemed to avoid further escalating the situation. Pakistan, meanwhile, began a crackdown on militants, arresting suspected militants, shutting down a large number of religious schools, and announcing its intent to update existing laws according to international standards. Meanwhile, Khan faced a looming debt crisis. Pakistan's debt commitments had ballooned over the years preceding his term in office, not least due to the CPEC project financed by loans from China. Pakistan's first repayments were due to begin in 2019. Khan had campaigned on promises of increased welfare and against seeking intervention from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, whose lending conditions often required austerity measures and whose previous dozen packages to Pakistan had failed to solve the country's macroeconomic problems. Indeed, he began his premiership seeking aid from allies rather than from the IMF. In mid-October, having failed to secure foreign aid from allies, Pakistan requested $12 billion in emergency lending from the IMF. Khan continued to seek foreign aid, however, and reached investment arrangements with China in December and with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in January 2019. With the advent of the global COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020, Khan was reluctant to implement a lockdown on the country's already ailing economy. In Sindh, the province most affected by the pandemic and the only province whose government was not led by either the PTI or an allied party, a strict lockdown was implemented on March 23. As the pandemic worsened across the country, a nationwide lockdown was eventually imposed at the beginning of April until early May, when restrictions began to be lifted in phases. Opposition to Khan and the PTI flared in late 2020, fueled by allegations of corruption and economic discontent. In September, the PMLN, the PPP, and other parties in the opposition formed a coalition, known as the Pakistan Democratic Movement, PDM, which sought to increase the independence of civilian government from the military establishment. The PDM staged protests and rallies, some addressed by Nawaz Sharif, calling by video from exile. With opposition sustained into the following year, Khan sought a vote of confidence in March 2021. He narrowly survived, but the PDM had boycotted the vote.